On the night of March 23rd, 1945, a pale moon cast its light over the dark waters of the Rhine River, one of the last great natural barriers protecting the heart of Nazi Germany. On the eastern bank, German soldiers watched the opposite shore with growing unease. In recent days, disturbing reports had piled up, intense movement, the constant rumble of engines, bridges being assembled, columns of vehicles arriving without pause. Everything pointed to a massive invasion about to begin. German artillery was repositioned, reserves were rushed forward, officers kept their men on permanent alert. If that attack came, it could decide the fate of the war in Europe. But the attack never came. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. Because the enormous army the Germans believed was there simply did not exist. The tanks were inflatable, the trucks were fake, the bridges were stage props. The sounds came from recordings. And the soldiers behind the operation numbered only about 1,000 men. Men whose primary weapon was not the rifle, but imagination. This secret unit would become known decades later as the Ghost Army. To understand why something like this was created, we must go back a few years. World War II was the most devastating conflict in human history. Massive battles consumed resources and lives on an unprecedented scale. Offensive operations often resulted in tens of thousands of casualties in just a few days. Allied commanders knew that to defeat Germany, they would have to push through heavily defended territory. Direct frontal assaults would be extraordinarily costly. They needed a way to weaken enemy resistance before the fighting even began. The answer came from an ancient idea, one rarely applied on such a massive scale: military deception. If the enemy could be convinced the attack would come from somewhere else, they would concentrate their forces there. If they believed they were facing an overwhelming army, they might hesitate or even withdraw. In other words, battles could be won by manipulating perception. This led to the creation of the U.S. Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit unlike any other. Its members were not chosen solely for combat ability. Many were artists, designers, architects, set builders, sound engineers, radio operators, and specialized technicians, men accustomed to creating artificial realities. Now, those skills would be used to deceive one of the most dangerous armies in the world. Their training was intensive and highly unconventional. They learned advanced camouflage techniques, improvised engineering, radio signal manipulation, and the psychology of perception. But above all, they learned to think like illusionists. Their mission was to construct a false reality so convincing that the enemy would accept it as truth. One of the most iconic elements of their operations was inflatable equipment. Tanks, trucks, heavy artillery, all made of rubber and reinforced canvas. Foldable, lightweight, and easily transportable. They could be inflated within minutes and positioned rapidly. From a distance, or from the air, they were almost indistinguishable from real vehicles. But appearance alone was not enough. A stationary army would raise suspicion. So the unit developed a complex system to simulate constant activity. Real trucks drove repeated loops to create tracks. Heavy chains were dragged across the ground to imitate tank treads. Equipment was repositioned daily to suggest tactical movement. Tents were erected and dismantled. Campfires were lit. Even military trash was strategically scattered. It was a complete performance. The audio component was just as sophisticated. Sound engineers recorded authentic noises of battalions in motion, tanks advancing, bridges being assembled, troops marching, engines running at different speeds. These recordings were played through massive loudspeakers mounted on vehicles. The sound could carry for miles. At night, when visibility was limited, the effect was terrifyingly realistic. German soldiers could hear what sounded like an entire army preparing to attack, even when no one was there. The third key element was electronic deception. Highly trained radio operators simulated full communications between fictitious units. They copied transmission patterns, schedules, and even the individual style of real operators. For German intelligence, intercepting these signals was routine, and everything sounded completely legitimate. The illusion was reinforced by multiple sources: visual observation, radio interception, patrol reports, all pointed to the same conclusion. A large army was present, even when it wasn't. One of the first major operations took place shortly after D-Day, as Allied forces advanced through occupied France. The Ghost Army was tasked with simulating armored divisions in a region where no real attack was planned. For days, they created the illusion of an imminent offensive. Fake tanks were deployed. Engine noises echoed through the night. False communications flooded the radio spectrum. The Germans reacted exactly as intended. Troops and artillery were moved to contain the supposed attack, while the real Allied advance unfolded elsewhere, facing far less resistance. Similar operations continued throughout the war, growing ever more daring. In some cases, the unit simulated entire divisions with only a few hundred men. The psychological impact was devastating. Uncertainty forced German commanders to disperse their forces, and a dispersed army is a weaker army. But these missions were far from safe. The Ghost Army often operated close to the front lines. If enemy patrols approached too closely, the deception could be exposed, and in that moment the unit lacked the firepower to defend itself. Still, they continued, knowing that every successful mission saved lives. When the time came to cross the Rhine, one of the most dangerous operations of the war, the unit was deployed again. They created the illusion that a massive force would attempt the crossing at a specific location. For days, they staged intense preparations. Inflatable bridges were positioned, fake vehicles lined the shore, engineering sounds echoed continuously. Across the river, German forces concentrated their defenses. Meanwhile, the real crossing took place somewhere else, encountering far lighter resistance. This deception played a decisive role in accelerating the collapse of German defenses in the West. After the war ended, the existence of the Ghost Army remained classified. Its members returned to civilian life without public recognition. Many were never allowed to speak about what they had done. Some became famous artists. Others became architects, professors, designers, men who had fought an entire war built on illusion. Only decades later did the details begin to emerge. Historians were astonished by the sophistication and effectiveness of their operations. Estimates suggest the unit's actions saved tens of thousands of Allied lives, not by destroying the enemy, but by forcing it to fight threats that did not exist. The Ghost Army revealed something fundamental about the nature of war. Victory does not depend on military strength alone. It depends on information, on perception, on belief, because an army reacting to illusions is, in effect, fighting itself. And on that silent night in March 1945, while German soldiers watched tanks that would never advance, The real blow was already falling somewhere else, without fanfare, without glory, without their awareness. An invisible army had decided the fate of the war.